Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure on behalf of the university and the Department of English to present John Crowe Ransom as the seventh Ewing Lecturer. These lectures, which have been made possible by a very generous gift, have been designed to bring to the students, the faculty, and the friends of the university men and women of distinguished literary achievement. Certainly, Mr. Ransom fills that qualification abundantly. Educated at Vanderbilt University and as a Rhodes Fellow at Oxford, he served with the American Expeditionary Forces in the First World War, out of which came his first volume of poems, Poems About God, in 1919, and then he returned to his teaching at Vanderbilt, where he became a member of, indeed I think it not too much to say, the creative center of a group of people who have since emerged as notable poets and critics and writers in our country. During these years, he continued to produce verse, Chills and Fever in 1924, Grace After Meat in the same year, and Two Gentlemen in Bonds in 1926. He was also connected with the magazine, the little magazine perhaps, Fugitive, from 1922 to 1925. The magazine that gave its name to this group. Also during these years, he published a prose volume, God Without Thunder. In 1937, he was invited to move from Vanderbilt to Kenyon College, where he became Carnegie Professor of Poetry. And there, in these many years since 1937, he founded the Summer Kenyon School of English, which is carrying on vigorously as the School of Letters at Indiana University. But perhaps more important than this was his initial editorship of the Kenyon Review, a superbly creative editorship which made this journal under his guidance one of the two or three truly distinguished literary magazines of our country and our century. This is a major achievement on Mr. Ransom's part. Finally, in addition to his continuing writings, The World's Body in 1938 and the important essay New Criticism in 1941, his selected poems of 1945, in addition to these achievements, Mr. Ransom became not only the teacher, but in the truest sense, the mentor of some of the most important of our contemporary writers. To name only three, Randall Jarrell, Robert Lowell, and Peter Taylor. Thus, as teacher, as critic, as creative editor, and as poet, we present Mr. Ransom as this year's Ewing Lecturer. Tomorrow, in the same room at 4, and on Wednesday evening here again, but at 8 o'clock, he will treat in 3 lectures his subject for the whole series, what he has called the daring poise of poetry. Fabulous, musical, high-hearted, yet capable of mortal fall. His first lecture, If Fable Lapses into Doctrine. His second lecture, If Formal Music Subsides into Prose. And his third lecture, If Valor is Put Out by Horror. I present to you then, with pleasure and as a singular privilege, Mr. John Crowe Ransom.
I'm greatly honored to be here. I have to say that there may seem some peculiarity in my lectures by virtue of an understanding which apparently is held by the Los Angeles editor of the University of California Press. I think that the understanding of these lectures is that they will subsequently be printed. And so Mr. Zachary wrote me a very nice note in which he says, we look forward to having you on the premises and eventually to publishing your manuscript. It goes without saying that we invite you to extend your remarks without limit. I take that to mean that he doesn't expect me to air all of the extension of my remarks orally at the lectures, but to present a few considerations about poetry by way of note. And then I think perhaps at least half of the three lectures will be spent on illustration, because I don't have the effrontery to point out the poets, unless they are old poets long ago, that seem to bring poetry downhill into a kind of disrepute because they didn't hold up to the standards. But I've always been very much interested in the young poets that I have known and with whose work I could become acquainted when they got into print. And so I want to read especially from the young poets, and most of my readings will be modern. I think I'd better repeat that strange title. It wasn't the first title which I sent in, but you know that it's almost impossible to make a general title for treatment of poetry that has any starch in it or any vitality. And so I used what I thought might be an old form. I think I know that I've seen long titles. I don't know whether any were this long in perhaps 16th and 17th century work. And I'll read the general title again, if you'll permit me. The brave poise of the full poem. Fabulous, musical, high-spirited, but not incapable of mortal fall. First lecture, if fable decays into dogma. Second lecture, if formal music decays into prose. Third lecture, if valor decays into pure horror, which cannot be resolved. The first lecture will consider a property of poetry which brings it close to religion, though we must keep the distinction sharp between them. The second lecture will represent poetry as having an oral or oral property by virtue of which it makes music. And the third lecture will represent that property of poetry which brings it closest to morality. That sounds very stern. I think I'd better make a huge disclaimer at the start that I'm not the one. I think I've never been, but certainly I'm not now the one who wants to issue commandments to poets, especially commandments in the negative, thou shalt not. We have to be grateful for every experimental form of verse, and so it will be in a very tentative manner that I want to indicate how poetry may fall from its highest estate. I thought that I would like to begin by something that's really very simple. In talking about how not a poem is composed, but let's say a floral arrangement. I had thought a little of doing that. And yesterday, in the clear skies, when my plane began to come over the Los Angeles County, it struck me that I had never seen a great city that was so colorful. Every unit of it, every residence unit of it, and its great business buildings, its college buildings, institutional buildings, they're colorful. I like that so much. It's a good place to be for that reason as for all the others. And so suppose that we have to compose a floral arrangement, let's say a bouquet of the flowers out of the garden. And Aristotle casually laid down, and it's perfectly final, that nothing can be added to what he said, a description of the four causes. And he was thinking of that kind of project which involves the human intellect. It's an operation which has a beginning and an ending, and then it has various properties under which you can look at it. So the first cause would be obviously the material cause of what will we compose the floral bouquet. Well, they are flowers singly and in mass of various shapes and substances and masses, and they have their stems, and we probably put some foliage in there, and they complicate the effect. And we practice a kind of trial and error method of getting something. Unless we are very experienced pros, in that case I think we would know more quickly what we ought to do with the particular flowers. And we arrange them in such a way that the individual flowers will be able to show in their particularity, in their individuality, and that the masses will show to good advantage, and that on the whole we look at the prospect, the silhouette, and it presents to us an example of not of absolute or perfect symmetry, but of occult symmetry. In other words, close to the vertical axis on one side we might have a rather massive effect. That would have to be balanced by a very much less massive effect far out on the axis of the other side, in the same way with the vertical axis, or rather with the horizontal axis up and down. But we have not mutilated the flowers. We have not destroyed their individuality. Yet they have definitely come into a pattern. The second cause would be the efficient cause. In this case, it is the composer with his hands, with tools, putting them in their positions. And the third cause will be the formal cause. And that Aristotle would have said, and possibly did say somewhere, that under the head of the formal cause, it must look natural. It must look like a product of nature. It must look spontaneous, not something we have created. We have merely touched it and arranged it a little, just as we take beautiful flowers from the wild and put them into our gardens and in rows and beds, and we give a formal effect to them there, but more so here in the arrangement of the bouquet. Now those three causes are quite contemporaneous, simultaneous. There must be in the mind of the efficient cause, the agent, all the way through. And we come to the final cause, and it's just as much the first cause as it is the last cause. It's primarily the first cause. What is the object of it, and what are we going to do with it when we've got it? Well, that brings up to my mind, as the best, the first and perhaps still the best statement of the formal cause, Aristotle's third critique, the critique of judgment, or the judgment of taste or beauty, in which beauty appears to us fundamentally, mostly, I think he thought, it was far from an exhaustive treatment. It had few examples, but a very careful statement of the philosophical principles involved. It looks like a bit of nature which has its own order. We attempted to say it's moral just as we are. We like things which have pattern and order and permanence, therefore. But this seems to have come natural. Therefore, there is in nature a principle which is intelligent as we are. And so the magic name of beauty, which is not definable in some such, except in some such terms as that we have a formal order which seems like the work of intelligence in what might have been a confusion. Well, now when we come to the poem, I'll use Aristotle again, because in what I suppose is the earliest great work of a critic, and perhaps the most comprehensive yet, he told about the plays of the tragic playwrights. And he laid down several rules. This is where fabulous comes in, only with him it was mythos, or mythical. Fable was not a Greek word. The mythos is a plot. But then mythos is very double in meaning. And I think since that time, when he wrote on the nature of poetry, the poetics, since that time, I believe that it has remained true that the word myth is double, although it's usual to translate his word there legendary. The mythos is the legend which supplies the plot for the Greek tragic playwright. It's the history, or it comes before history really, it precedes history. It's the legend of the heroic houses whose heroes sometimes were born of gods and who were in touch with the gods. Gods who sometimes, by means of a machine, were let down on the stage to speak and to order. And so legendary, obviously, includes what we call mythical in the sense that it involves supernatural agents beyond us. That was immediately translated, that was presently translated by the Italian critics of the 15th century, fabula, using the universal language, the Latin, and fabulous, fabulosus. But as the century wore on and they gained confidence in their own language, they made it favola, the Italian transliteration of the word. And they didn't fail to keep the words myth and mythical, transliterating the Greek. So they got so many ways there of emphasizing the fabulous quality, doing it both in Greek and in Latin. And then, strangely enough, the same thing happened with French critics. The same thing happened with English. The same thing happened even with German critics, although German as a language is not hospitable to the reception of Latinate terms, and no doubt other languages of Europe. So we've got a supernatural element. And we must talk a little bit about metaphysics. Art is a metaphysical occupation. And I would start on the subject of metaphysics. It's very simple, and please forgive me. I don't mean to underrate the audience. I know most of you know this very well. If there's anyone who doesn't, I think I can do it very briefly. He defined the understanding, that is the science of the mind, the scientific faculty of the mind, as using two kinds of terms: the concept, that's the universal, and the percept, that's the particular. The concept is what the mind concludes as a principle in a single time. One word will do it. The principle of the sense objects which all have the same definition, or which we might say define the universal. And that universal, of course, is stripped down in terms of the sense images that compose it, that validate it, that is stripped down to the leanest possible skeleton of the thing, the fewest properties, the properties which are the essential properties and which will identify that universal in distinction to all others. And Kant argued that you cannot have a concept without a percept. The concept without a percept is blind. It doesn't see what it's talking about. The senses cannot take hold of it. And you can't have a percept without at least an embryonic concept, because the percept is empty. It's the other way. The concept is empty without the percept, and the percept is blind. It doesn't see any direction, doesn't see where it's going. It seems pointless. The great splurge of the imagery without leading to a universal. So they go together. And yet, when questions arise in what he calls the pure reason which does not have the advantage of being able to validate the concepts, the universals in terms of sense imagery, such ideas come to us as God, the soul, immortality, the moral order, and a host of such terms which we can never prove by having access to our senses. But to keep those terms from being empty and meaningless, we are obliged to give them a fictitious sense identity, and that will be by the act of the imagination. The imagination is the creative faculty, and though we don't have actually a sense of these universals propounded, these ideas, or pure ideas is his preferred term, propounded by the faculty of reason in us, nevertheless we instruct the imagination to make the best of the situation by making up images, sense images, and we entertain them in our minds as if we had seen them. Therefore, the word imitation, or mimesis, which has been so resented by Aristotle's successors, where he says that the poem, the tragedy, is an imitation of the actual, although it's deeply bitten by a fabulous possession. Mimesis should be translated fiction just in the way that we understand the term in reference to novels and short stories. It will apply just as well to poems, where the argument or the plot is not true but fictitious, and it's made to look true. The imagination does a good job on it, and then logic, science, the faculty of making judgments and of putting things in order, does the rest of it. That is to say, it holds it to its duty, and the plot must be perspicuous. We can follow it. and it must be tolerably convincing, so that he even said that a probable impossibility is better than an unconvincing probability. We wonder about that, but he goes on to say, that is, if it's impossible with respect to our sense experience, nevertheless it's possible with respect to the fantasy or the fabulous which we have put into it. I probably will add a little more as I go along, but now I want to turn to some reading. So much depends on the quality of our young writers. We have a very strong group of middle-aged writers, or writers close to middle age. Well, it depends on how old they're going to get. But they had a hard time in this respect when you think of poets in this country at the same time flourishing, such as going back to Robinson and Frost. They make a kind of a pairing, and then Pound and Eliot, another kind of pairing, a school of verse, and then Wallace Stevens and William Carlos Williams, they pair together too. Not to mention some who won't pair up very well, like Miss Marianne Moore and a host of others. Well, the next generation of poets started in their shadow, but they came out with flying colors. They defined themselves as individuals, and so their poetry became unlike another poetry. And I take that for granted. That's now a familiar history. I am using here a little book issued last year called Contemporary American Poetry. It has nearly 200 pages, selected and introduced by Donald Hall, now at Michigan, I think, a good poet himself. And these are the younger poets. They started between the Great War and 50, some of them, and others didn't start till into the 50s. And he thinks that the business of a poet is not to accept the available traditions, and especially the styles available in the generation just finished or the generation before the last, but to be original. And I'm sure that that's very sound, that any poem must be original. When we talk about being mythical, being fabulous, poets, that I think that testifies to a religiosity of on their point. They are giving a form to the best of their ability to spirits, to gods, but they are very freewheeling theologically. They are not normally following an orthodox theology. I think I'll say more about that presently in connection with some of the poems I want to read. And the first one would be by a poet and a story writer, Robert Creeley, who has always written as if he were totally unsophisticated, but really he has remarkable sophistication, and he went to Harvard. So that this is a fiction, as if it were the thought of an ingenuous and spirited but unsophisticated person. And what I'm going to start on with him is a little series of love poems. Now I'm starting from now and going back on them. He wrote a little poem, a tiny poem called Kore, K-O-R-E. If he had said Korah, C-O-R-A or K-O-R-A, that might well have meant Persephone, the goddess or the daughter of a goddess. The word means maiden or virgin, who had dwelt a period on earth, 6 months, let's say, the period of the flowers. Her mother was the goddess of vegetation. And then old Pluto came along and hailed her off to his kingdom to spend the rest of the year in the lower world. But this is simply a maiden, and it's a Greek maiden, because you'll see from the context, though not that particular one. And to suit the idea of a totally unsophisticated poet, not even a possessor of a very rich strain of verbal experience, it's very simple. It's 6 little stanzas of very short lines. Some of them may rhyme, and again they may not. As I was walking, I came upon chance walking the same road upon. As I sat down by chance to move later, if and as I might, light the wood was, light and green, and what I saw before I had not seen. It was a lady accompanied by goatmen leading her. Her hair held earth, her eyes were dark, a double flute made her move. And the last stanzas are quotes, "O love, where are you leading me now?" The goatmen are the disciples of Dionysus, and so they are taking her to be initiated into the Dionysian revels. That would be the end of her maidenhood, but nevertheless, that's a life poem. I mean by that that sometime that's an experience that she must have. And then a poem by James Wright. Every time I mention a poem, there's these other 2 properties of the poem, the music and the morality to discuss, but I'll try just to make the briefest mention of that. A gesture by a lady with an assumed name. And I will ask you, as I read the 6 stanzas, to be imagining who the lady really was. I have an idea, but I don't know if it's correct. This is a pretty good order of blank verse. There's much more substance in this poem than in the other. There may not be a bigger idea, I don't mean that. And the first 3 stanzas are statements about the gesture, and the last 3 stanzas are questions as to what is its meaning. The first 3 stanzas concern the letters she left behind when she died, when she went. The next one, the laundry she left on the floor, and the next one, the lovers she left cluttering the town. Letters she left to clutter up the desk, burned in the general gutter when the maid came in to do the room and take the risk of slipping off the necklace round her head. Laundry she left to clutter up the floor, hung to rachitic skeletons of girls with not good spines, poor girls who worked the bars or labored up the stair to crown her blousy ribbons on their curls. Lovers she left to clutter up the town, mourned in the chilly morgue and went away, all but the husbands sneaking up and down the stairs of that apartment house all day. Who were they looking for? the cold pretense of lamentation offered in a stew, a note, a gift, a shred of evidence to love when there was nothing left to do? Or did they rise to weep for that unheard of love that will be her love? They whose misery cries and does not care whether or not the madam hears a word or skinny children watch the trodden stair. Whether or not, how could she love so many, then turn away to die as though for none? I saw the last offer a child a penny to creep outside and see if the cops were gone. Got a little of the vernacular in that. And I think I would assume that the lady's identity, the lady's real name was Caritas, charity, which had that manifestation. And then I come to a much older, bigger poem. There's very little fault to find with those young poets, except that they're young, and they don't do as big works. They don't extend their remarks. They don't elaborate the poems. Here is one of the finest love poems of the language, written by John Donne, the Ecstasy. In those days, when we had sight of an object, it was because corpuscles, little bodies from the eye, went out and then reported on their contact with the object, which became translated physiologically into the sight or the vision of the object. But then I'm sure that physics never intended such complications as arise here. In the first half of the poem, I'm not going to read quite all of it, about a good deal of it, first half of the poem, where the lovers do nothing but look at each other, where, like a pillow on a bed, a pregnant bank swelled up to rest the violet's reclining head, sat we two, one another's best. Our hands were firmly cemented with a fast balm which thence did spring. Our eye-beams twisted and did thread our eyes upon one double string. So to intergraft our hands as yet was all the means to make us one, and pictures in our eyes to get was all our propagation. As twixt two equal armies fate suspends uncertain victory, our souls, which to advance their state had gone out, hung twixt her and me. And whilst our souls negotiate there, we like sepulchral statues lay. All day the same our postures were, and we said nothing all the day. And so far as we've come at this point, we must imagine not merely the coy lady, but the shy gentleman. So that was all day their posture. But oh, alas, so long, so far, our bodies, why do we forbear? They are ours, though they are not we. We are the intelligences, they the spheres. We owe them thanks because they thus did us to us at first convey, yielded their forces, sense to us, nor a dross to us, but allay or alloy. On man heaven's influence works not so, but that it first imprints the air. So soul into the soul may flow, though it to body first repair. As our blood labors to beget spirits, as like souls as it can, because such fingers need to knit that subtle knot which makes us man, so must pure lovers' souls descend to affections and to faculties, which sense may reach and apprehend, else a great prince in prison lies, that is the soul. And if some lover such as we have heard this dialogue of one, let him still mark us. He shall see small change when the body's gone. I think it has to be said, insofar as the fabulous is concerned, that John Donne was a deprived man. He was brought up in the Roman faith, and then the laws of the kingdom forbade members of that faith to receive their education at the national universities, and inflicted other disabilities upon them. And he was profoundly versed in theology and philosophy, insofar as philosophy went in that age in England. But he had no orthodoxy at the moment. He was later to join the Church of England and to celebrate in a long poem the anniversaries as to how he found his faith sufficiently, and how he could become a clergyman in the Anglican faith. But here all the way through, I think he is being fabulous, and I think the dignity of the poem comes to us because its diction has so many references to the faith and to philosophy. I turn to another order of the fabulous. The author of the second poem I read was James Wright, and I want to read another poem of his. But in view of the time, I'll skip that poem and read from a poem I haven't yet read. That's from a Minnesota man named Robert Bly. But he too has had a lot of education, and it's by pure preference that he likes life close to the ground, and he likes it to be humble, and he likes to live in a small house in the farmland of Minnesota, because his mystical experience, and this is by way of having some fabulous element that sounds very like a spontaneous religious experience. In 3 stanzas: I am driving, it is dusk, Minnesota. The stubble field catches the last growth of sun. The soybeans are breathing on all sides. Old men are sitting before their houses on car seats in the small towns. I am happy. The moon rising above the turkey sheds. That account of nature is going to get more and more lyrical until finally it's clearly a piety or a religious experience. The small world of the car plunges through the deep fields of the night on the road from Wilmar to Milan. This solitude covered with iron moves through the fields of night, penetrated by the noise of crickets. Nearly to Milan, suddenly a small bridge and water kneeling in the moonlight. In small towns, the houses are built right on the ground. The lamplight falls on all fours on the grass. When I reach the river, the full moon covers it. A few people are talking low in a boat. that is talked about by the editor of the Contemporary Anthology, Donald Hall, especially the lines, in small towns the houses are built right on the ground, as if this were the reason. The lamplight falls on all fours in the grass. The lamplight wants to reach. It has a message for people. It's light in the darkness. So the houses are built low, and it opens to the west and the north and the south, and then the east and the south. And through the windows on each side, it as if falls on all fours in the grass. To be observed there, to be remarked as a way that man's natural impulse to religion is accommodated, entirely without benefit of any conventional mythology. And I read from another little book, which is called, before this book was printed, I used to read from this book more. It was the only one I had that was strictly an anthology of the younger poets. Personal and Impersonal, 6 Aesthetic Realists. That's a term given by the editor, Eli Siegel, author of Hot Afternoons Have Been in Montana. And he took in charge a group of 6 poets, and he advised them well. It's not quite in the usual philosophical language, but he advised them well, and then he praised them, perhaps a little too much. I don't know about that. And I read 2 poems from Nancy Starrells, who was one of the group. I read this once to an audience in which a young man became very much excited, and later he came up to me and said, "I used to date that girl." Well, this one is called Dear Rabbit. These seem like very humble poems, but I would like to add at least one more general remark, that my conception about that plot or argument which makes the substance of the poem and is carried out with sufficient logic so that we can follow it, my conception of that situation is that it must be a crucial situation. That means an important one, and we've had it many times before, but here it has a definitive treatment and a successful one, and it's crucial in the sense that now it's habit forming. We know where we belong now. And an incident which is not crucial can't be quite so important. It won't have a proper resolution, nor will it have unless we know it's crucial because we've been there too. It won't carry the force of something crucial to the auditor. Dear Rabbit, I put a pillowcase upon my head and stood on sofas and hid in corners. You laughed and said I was a rabbit, and that pleased you. Oh, my God, being a rabbit-headed girl I thought was good. So I jumped from chair to chair, nibbling the edges of brightly colored books, mumbling little words beneath my pillow head, words you didn't hear because I didn't mean them to be heard. Now it is late, and I am sad. I cannot see with this thing upon my head. I cannot breathe, and the muffled sounds I make are lost inside the pillowcase. Dear rabbit girl, you say, and pat my head. But that isn't at all satisfactory. That's tragic, and she won't play such games after this. A much bigger poem, but shorter. There is no pain in things. In things as they are, there is no pain. The green leaf means what the tree intends, and happily could not be without the circle. Through leaves the purposeful sun comes darkly as light on the sober ground, makes friendly room for shadows, and the expectant squirrel no longer trembles, knowing now where he belongs. She was so pained by the thought of the pain experienced by the little animals and the vegetation. But when she looked at it philosophically, religiously, she says there's no pain as long as they are where they were intended to be and perform their function. So it's a very, very religious thesis she has there. I must read one other poem, though. I think I want to go back in that field, the more nearly religious fabulous, to read. And what I would read would be something from Wallace Stevens. He regarded the world like a naturalist. We know what it is. We should live with it boldly, knowing what it is. And so he intended to have no theology. But he said, all the same, the sun is the great thing in our world. We know that man lives by it, by its heat, by its light, by the vegetation which it produces. We couldn't do without it, and quite often he apostrophized the sun as if the sun were a god, and so the sun was as close as he came to having a god. And a fine poet, very masculine and queer, with nothing ever soft or sentimental. But here he writes to good intent. The brave man, that's the sun, but he's a big man, big brother, big God. The sun, that brave man, comes through boughs that lie in wait, that brave man. Green and gloomy eyes in dark forms of the grass run away. The good stars, pale helms and spiky spurs run away. Fears of my bed, fears of life and fears of death run away. That brave man comes up from below and walks without meditation, that brave man. And then presently the sun sets, so he writes the next poem about a fading of the sun. It frightens people, in spite of the moon. Though he's not a man of the moon, he says. We are children of the sun. Who can think of the sun costuming clouds when all people are shaken? That is, who can enjoy the red of the sunset and when it means the approaching of night? When all people are shaken, or of night, and dazzled proud, when people awaken and cry for help. Two more questions and then the answer. The warm antiquity of self, everyone, grows suddenly cold. The tea is bad, bread sad. How can the world so old be so mad that the people die? If joy shall be without a book, that is a book of instruction, it lies themselves within themselves. If they will look within themselves and cry for help, here's the answer. Within, as pillars of the sun, supports of night, the tea, the wine is good, the bread, the meat is sweet, and they will not die. But though that was the man of the sun, he couldn't keep from occasionally trying other gods. And it happens that one which precedes those sun poems by 2 or 3 pages is about the rock as the sun. representing strength, stability, eternity, our refuge, our fortress, and so on. And in the very last days of his life, he wrote beautifully about the rock in a little volume entitled The Rock, which became his official God thing, so to speak. How to live, what to do. Last evening the moon rose above this rock, impure, upon a world unpurged. The man and his companion stopped to rest before the heroic height. They were theologians, I think. Coldly the wind fell upon them in many majesties of sound. They that had left the flame-freaked sun to seek a sun of fuller fire. Instead, there was this tufted rock, massively rising high and bare, beyond all trees, the ridges thrown like giant arms among the clouds. There was neither voice nor crested image, no chorister nor priest. There was only the great height of the rock and the two of them standing still to rest. There was the cold wind and the sound it made, away from the muck of the land that they had left. Heroic sound, joyous and jubilant and sure. Thank you.